Good. So welcome to our second webinar of our three-part webinar series on shaping provisioning systems for an eco-social transformation. Today's topic is the democratization of provisioning systems. My name is Bärnthaler. I'm a social scientist at the Institute for Multi-Level Governance and Development at WU Vienna, and I will moderate this evening. That means the next 75 to 90 minutes. In doing so, I will first briefly contextualize this webinar series, and second, say some words about the concept of provisioning systems for those of you who are not familiar with it. Subsequently, I will introduce today's topic and our three speakers. Then each participant will give an input for about 10 minutes, followed by a few questions I will ask across the panelists. And finally, we will end as usual with audience Q&A. I would also like to make you aware of the fact that this session is being recorded. So to start a little bit with the context of this webinar series, this series is embedded in some broader related endeavors. First, it is part of a special issue that is currently being developed and will be published in the journal Sustainability, Science, Practice and Policy sometime next year. And second, it is also a kind of attunement, is maybe the correct word, for Julia Steinberger's Karl Polanyi Gast Professorship 2023 in Vienna, to which we are already very much looking forward to. In this context, I would also like to thank the International Karl Polanyi Society, as well as the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for the support. Now, very briefly, I would like to start with some words about the notion of provisioning systems, for those of you who are not familiar with this concept. Provisioning perspective is basically a different way to look at and understand the economy. Neoclassical economics in particular has focused on a notion of the economy as something like a uniform space, as one big market, as Polanyi called it, within which nameless and substitutable commodities are produced, exchanged and consumed. The idea of provisioning systems, in contrast, argues that the economy consists of different non-substitutable systems that operate according to different logics and must therefore be understood not only in their particularity, but also within the context in which they operate. For example, there is a food system, there's an energy system, there's a housing system, there is a care system, there's an education system, a transport system, and so on. And obviously, the food system is quite different from the housing system. And also quite obviously, the housing system in Bangkok is very different from that in Vienna. So provisioning perspective therefore rejects formalist, that is neoclassical approaches to economic analysis. Instead, it is, in a Polanyian tradition, committed to a substantivist analysis, thereby engaging with actually existing economic formations. Hence, a provisioning perspective redefines economics, in line again with Polanyi, as the science of how we actually organize our livelihood. As the feminist economist Julie Nelson puts it, such a redefinition refocuses economics on the provisioning of human life. The Greek root of both the words economics and ecology is oikos, meaning house. Economics could be about how we live in our house, the earth, quote end. And this also highlights that provisioning systems are the intermediate link between biophysical resource use and social outcomes. So provisioning systems transform resources to satisfy certain needs, for example, housing or nutrition. So to sum up, a provisioning perspective allows us to understand the provisioning of goods and services, not as a process of isolated rational decision-making, but as a collective, social, and deeply political process that is organized in accordance with existing values, capitalist dynamics, social relations, and social structures, including class, gender, culture, power, politics, and society-nature relations. And this leads to today's topic, the democratization of provisioning systems. For if provisioning systems actually determine how we can actually organize our livelihood, they should quite obviously be a primary purpose of politics. However, today the primary focus lies on issues like green consumerism, ethical consumption, individual lifestyle choices. But as laudable as such forms of individual behavior might be, they are also outstandingly ineffective as climate policy, because they are only concerned with how we behave within given structures, and thereby fail to politicize these structures, that is, provisioning systems themselves. So if we want to collectively decide on the structures that enable and constrain us as individuals, or in other words, if we want to collectively decide on how we live in our house, the earth, to enable a good life for all within the planetary feasible, the democratization of provisioning system becomes a key concern. And this brings me to today's speakers, which I will introduce in the order of the subsequent inputs. First, Viviana Asara is an assistant professor at the University of Ferrara. Her research focuses on environmental politics and sociology, on social movements, movement parties, degrowth, political ecology, and democracy. Some of her recent publications include Untangling the Radical Imaginaries of the Indignados movement, Commons, Autonomy, and Ecologism. And she was also one of the editors of the recent Handbook of Critical Environmental Politics. In her input, Viviana will talk about a social movement perspective to democratizing provisioning systems, looking particularly into how transformative or radical social innovations engendered by urban movements can build social infrastructures and redefine public services through co-production. After Viviana, Margaret Haderer will provide us with her input. Margaret is a postdoc university assistant at the Technical University of Vienna. Her research focuses on housing, the right to the city, environmental politics, urban experiments, political theory, and the history of political ideas. Recent publications include Emancipatory Politics and Its Limits, ? With Ingolfo Blüdon and Felix Butzlaff. And we're also already very excited about her new book that will be published next year by the University of Amsterdam Press, titled Rebuilding Cities and Citizens, Mass Housing in Red Vienna and Cold War Berlin. In her input, Margaret will endorse the idea of a good life for all within planetary boundaries as a normative ideal, while also questioning the very possibility of a materially reductive modernity. In so doing, she will also discuss the link between material expansion on the one hand and social emancipation, democratization on the other. Finally, Matthew Noah Smith is an associate professor in the Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. His primary areas of research are in moral and political philosophy, where he explores questions in normative ethics and political theory from the perspective of practical agency embedded in a social world. Some of his latest publications include Reliance Structures, How Urban Public Policy Shapes Human Agency, and a book that I can only highly recommend. It's called The Spatial Contract, New Politics of Provision for an Urbanized Planet, which was published together with Alex Shafran and Stephen Hall in 2020 by Manchester University Press. In his input, Matthew will engage with the prospect of a rejection of the needed transformation of energy systems. He will thus, in a way, discuss the tension between democratic hopes and anti-democratic impositions of what is needed to stay within ecological limits. And without further ado, I will now give the screen to Viviana.
Thank you, Richard. I will now try to share. Let's see if it works. Is it working, right? Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so let's see how to change. Yes, so today's seminar is going to cover the democratizing provisioning system. So these are some of the questions that we were supposed to address. And this is the perspective I'm going to take for today's seminar. So social movement perspective, in the sense that I will be looking at the processes that have marginally democratized some provisioning systems at the local level, with a concern for social and environmental justice or a good life for all within limits. I will do this through a case study, research design, so this presentation privileges an empirical grounding and orientation rather than a purely theoretical abstraction. No? So I've looked at this topic from a social movement perspective. I'm going to focus maybe even more on the social component rather than on the ecological component of social provisioning. Social movements are a main actor of collective provisioning systems that encompass social and solidarity economy, public services, and social reproduction activities. And urban movements is a category of social movement especially concerned with provision system, as they're focused on collective consumption and urban environment, And one fundamental feature of urban movements since at least the turn of the new century lies in their mobilization against the commodification of the neoliberal city and the dismantling of the welfare state. Let's say that a wealth of literature has focused on the new grassroots forms of new forms of social organization based on solidarity, common and collective self-empowerment that were born with the so-called movement of the square, or after the Great Recession, looking more particularly at the unmediated character of their collective action. So the idea of not claiming something from the state, but directly changing some specific aspect of society. But in this presentation, actually, I will do something different. I will look exactly at their contribution to public services. So basically, these grassroots initiatives contribute to the production of public services, while they're based on self-organization. By intervening in the production of public services, sometimes with the support of public authorities, they contribute to their redefinition, intertwining the public with the struggle for the commons. So these are some of the questions to be addressed. How are the transformative innovation redefining public services and building a new meaning of what is public? How do they emerge and interrelate with public decision makers? What type of social and political processes and conditions can foster a democratized public ownership? And how can they contribute to radical welfare reforms? Social innovation is inserted into the so-called new modalities of governance, that around the marketization and privatization of the public sector, welfare state cuts, are also roll out neoliberalism involving decentralization, activation of civil society, public-private partnership, and actually, so they have social innovation has occupied the gaps and interstices in welfare provision. This concept involves a dialectical relationship between state and civil society actors that can be best grasped through the concept of co-production, which was a concept first introduced by Elinor Ostrom, which means the synergy between government and citizens, a new participatory and collaborative method through which citizens and service providers unite to define objectives, strategies, financing, and evaluation criteria of a public service. But the situation is not so rosy, as we know. So the social innovation, for example, has been, let's say, praised for its potential to revitalize democratic political systems and welfare state, and also for promoting greater participation, empowerment, and so on. But also, it was a tool to reduce actually public services. This we can find, for example, in the public administration theory. The literature that has mainly missed, or de-emphasized, let's say, an understanding of co-production as a political process that citizens engage with to secure changes in the relation with government, and also has not really studied so much them as for their orientation towards self-management and local control over local provision. And this is crucial, It's crucial to understand what type of social and political processes and conditions can foster a democratized public ownership. So public ownership intended as encompassing all those attempts, both outside and through the state, that reclaim economic space from capitalist social relations, or else all collective ownership subject to collective forms of decision-making, including commons. So I focused on the case of Cambatio, which I cannot really go into detail here, but just to say a few, some of the information. So the name is both the name of the citizen platform and the site, which was the former textile factory, which has been self-managed since 2011. So through the social movement platform managed to enter the space through a use lease of one block within the Cambatio space. And in 2019, actually, the movement platform was granted a 50-year use lease of 13,000 square meters of the space. So this is in the center of Barcelona. Sorry, I forgot to specify this. So in the working class neighborhood of Sants. And the idea of Cambadieu is to reclaim public services that were actually promised 40 years back in the General Urban Development Plan, and also to create new public services for the neighborhood. As we can see, there has been basically an expansion. Let's say this is the map of provision infrastructure of Cambadieu. Everything is decided through consensus democracy, and there has been an expansion from projects focusing on the cultural and recreational spheres to economic projects. All the projects are supposed to provide a social return to the neighborhood, which means whether social benefits and public services for the broader Cambadieu project and neighborhood. And the remunerative projects are also supposed to devote part of their revenues to the common fund. Two autonomous projects are the Social and Solidarity Economy Incubator Coopolis and the ecological grant of use co-housing cooperative La Borda. So it's a housing cooperative that is also a co-housing, and at the same time is it follows the Danish Andel model, which is for cooperative housing, which is a non-speculative model of housing according to use values. And it's all built according to ecological criteria. So it's a wooden, the tallest wooden building in Spain, and it's a low environmental impact building. So both Coopolis, so the Social and Solidarity Economy Incubator, and the co-housing cooperative actually have been inspirational sources for the public administration, for the state authorities, for subsequent policies on housing and on the social and solidarity economy. So let's discuss now this project. So the one driving force of Cambadieu, for Cambadieu's emergence, was the thrust to cover neighbors' needs. So to co-produce some of the facilities originally planned, as I mentioned, in the General Urban Development Plan of 40 years back, together with many new projects and public services with the support of regional and municipal authorities. What activists think they are doing is building the so-called public from the common, or communitarian public, where its public features is ensured by a sort of porousness towards the neighbors, and the other local actors, which can propose public services. So not only use and be users of the public services, but also actually propose and design new public services by participating into the assembly. In a sense, so they are actually countering this concept. The idea of this concept of public from the common is to counter, basically, to displace the neoliberal conception of public sector. So to displace the neoliberal conception of the public-private partnership with the public cooperative communitarian partnership, basically. Cambadieu can be thought also to embody, in a way, what David Hart called a double-pronged political attack. That means pressuring the government to deliver the promised public services, while reclaiming them as commons that activists contribute building. The 50-year session of use has been innovating into the legal institutional framework, and the state support at the same time is fundamental, is to guarantee the universality and gratuity of the public services. Okay, so, and another characteristic of Cambadieu is also related to the knowledge that the social economy and the third sector are providing, as I mentioned before, also for state authorities. So both of these, both the housing cooperative and the social and solidarity economy incubator, for example, have been inspirational sources for the policies on housing in Barcelona and on the social and solidarity economy. Another dimension to keep in mind is also the fact that the space is, it's a sort of space of deceleration. We could conceive it as a sort of space of deceleration in the sense that there is a constant preoccupation with the ecological dysfunction and waste. For example, everything is with an attention to recycling, to the ecological material, to avoiding greenfield construction. So there has not been any greenfield construction in the 14 hectares. But only refurbishment of the existing space. Sorry. And another dimension is the need to constitute autonomous projects, the willingness to constitute autonomous projects, so that basically the Cambadieu can be armored against changes in the political institutional landscape. So generating an alternative economy that can actually produce income, remunerative projects also that can feed into the common fund. This is seen as a basically as a guarantee for surviving, basically for not being dependent on state subsidies. Cambadieu is economically self-reliant for ordinary everyday management, but gets state funding for infrastructure and maintenance works, and as well for the bills. So the idea is to accept funding only when there is no, as mentioned previously, the idea of Cambadieu is to pressure the state to fulfill its obligation to build the public facilities that were promised 40 years back, but also to appropriate a vacant space, you know, and constantly modifying also the German urban development plan. This is done through a sort of a hybrid strategy of conflictive negotiations with the state authorities, collaboration, and a confrontational stance that basically is obtained, whereby basically cession of use or use leases are obtained thanks to the position of strength granted by the force of the movement. So, for example, using the instrument of retaliation and menace, and this happened, for example, when there was the vote in the municipal council for the 50-year use lease. Retaliation in the sense of like media campaign, massive demonstration that can be actually the movement can basically this can occur thanks to the position, thanks to the strength of the movement, as I said previously. I'm almost done. I just wanted to say something. So the public character is also a result of the coalition of various movements that breeding the initial Cambadieu platform. So this encompasses the neighborhood movement, the Indignato participants, the autonomous and the cooperative movement, the squatting movement, the environmental, the feminist. However, there are also some challenges, you know, and difficulties. So, for example, some unmet demands with some of the projects. I'm thinking about, for example, the urban park. And also, let's say, some challenges relating to mainly the important role supportive institutions have in these processes. So, for example, this was the case for the latest mandates of Barcelona en Comú government, but may not be the case also for future eventual governments. Another constraint or challenge is related to accessibility. That means that not all citizens have the capacity or desire to get involved as proactive actors in the co-production processes, and not all sectors are suitable. So, for example, the knowledge required and decision-making autonomy is sometimes beyond the scope of civil society organization for some sectors, such as health, for example. And also, another risk is related to what I mentioned at the very beginning. So the risk of using transformative innovation as a tool for offloading state responsibilities to civil society organization. So with the purpose of reducing the cost. And finally, the waning of the social movement strength, the waning of mobilization. So what happens when there is not the backing of the social movement? That means that it will lose the confrontational stance that it has towards public authorities. And also the waning, let's say, strength of the movement means also that public service providers could actually let's say, their self-interest behavior could actually, let's say, gain strength to vis-a-vis the public interest. So they could actually be more oriented towards the survival concerns of their own organization rather than the public interest, no? That should actually be privileged by for a public service, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Thanks. We move on to Margaret.
Viviana, we didn't talk about, or Richard, we didn't talk about slides. I don't have slides. I don't know.
That is perfectly fine.
Viviana. So now it's going to be quite a shift because I'm not going to talk about a concrete approach to democratize systems of provision, but I'm going to talk about the normative ideal that lies behind this event tonight, transforming systems of provision towards a good life for all within planetary boundaries. So workshop, or like this webinar, same as the SE, starts from the problem diagnosis that currently no country in the world meets citizens' needs at a sustainable level of resource use. And against the backdrop of this problem definition, there is a challenge to explore or define conditions for a good life within, for all within planetary boundaries. A challenge some regard as the central challenge of the 21st century. Julia Steinberger, for instance, belongs to them, Kate Rayworth, etc., etc. My own contribution tonight, it's not about providing clues about concrete possibilities for a good life for all within planetary boundaries, but as I mentioned before, a critical engagement with the normative ideal itself. I do so, and I say that from the get-go, not to debunk it, normative ideal, but to deliver hopefully a more circumspect understanding of why what seems necessary from one standpoint, e.g. the standpoint we in this community maybe share, the need for defining conditions for a good life for all within planetary boundaries. But the standpoint, what strikes us as necessary, a necessary standpoint may be regarded as a threat, as asking for the impossible from other standpoints. And the point here is to take that seriously. So maybe to put it slightly different, what motivates me is to better understand why what is to be done from a certain normative perspective has difficulties becoming a new normal. Analysis of power relations, of course, provide an answer to that, explain the recalcitrance of unsustainable systems of provision. But, and this is my point, what may be needed in addition, a more dialectical thinking, a both and thinking, as opposed to either or, a thinking in paradoxes in order to understand the gains in relation to regulative, in relation to a regulative ideal, but also the losses. So a good life for all within planetary boundaries may be good for some and bad, highly unattractive for others. It's important to understand that, especially if transition is the goal. So why the regulative ideal, a good life for all within planetary boundaries, I argue depends on major prerequisites, contested prerequisites. It implies the acceptance of planetary boundaries, which are, of course, not to be mistaken as hard facts to be lived by, but as boundaries that are, of course, informed by scientific knowledge and shaped by political negotiations. The concept or the regulative ideal also depends on an acceptance of universal equality as a norm. Apart from these arguably quite demanding prerequisites, living within planetary boundaries while securing a good life for all comes with another major implication, a shift towards sufficiency. That is a societal commitment to having enough, as Frankfurt puts it. That having enough is demarcated by a standard that allows people to develop, as Nussbaum and Sen put it, their capabilities that allow them to pursue a good life, or as Neve puts it, their objective needs, such as the need for subsistence, reproduction, security, leisure, spirituality, creativity, etc. Realizing sufficiency, or having enough, hinges on a discontinuation, exnovation, the limitation of materially intensive forms of life. In order, as Brand et al. puts it, in order to remain below a level that would be too much in terms of harmful emissions and resource extraction. As we know from natural scientific research, only improvements in efficiency by technological innovation, even if you're told otherwise, won't do the trick of staying within planetary boundaries. Yet while the necessary sufficiency may seem obvious in light of planetary boundaries, it may, against the backdrop of the history of modernity, also be rejected as impossible, as an unacceptable reversal of a history to which material expansion, the colonization of nature, was also key conditional to social emancipation, democratization. The work of Mitchell and the historian O'Neill also points to that. Put differently, while a reductive modernity, a term I take from Sommer and Welzel, seems necessary in light of socio-ecological crisis, realizing it may also mean breaking with modernity some of its promises and achievements. Promises and achievements we in the global north, we got to profit from in the global north, a break that is highly likely to, and in fact does trigger, first resistance, opposition, conflict. The Yellow-West conflicts are just one example. Current protests against or mobilizations for caps on gas and gas prices is maybe another example. I do not, to be clear, in any way seek to naturalize the unsustainable status quo or barriers to a shift towards a reductive modernity. My point is, in order for scientific analysis proposals to have drive, to be not only normatively desirable for convincing to those who already agree and are committed to a good life for all within planetary boundaries, maybe more work needs to be done on the following. On why what is to be done from a certain normative perspective doesn't or hardly does materialize. So the point I'm presenting here, maybe we need more analysis of both end logics, paradoxes, dialectics, such as the double role of a community provisioning. It's emancipatory, and that's maybe pointing towards your presentation, Viviana. It's of course both emancipatory, empowering in some senses, and overburdening, precarious, disciplining in other senses. They can community provisioning systems can serve democratic ends, but also nationalistic ones. My colleague Hauke Dannemann, for instance, is about to publish an article on Völkisch do-it-yourself communities in Germany, right-wing prefigurative politics, as one may put it. There is also the double role of democracy, and Matt is going to talk more about it. It can be inclusionary and exclusionary. So democratizing systems of provision, may lead towards greater sustainability, but it actually also may lead to keeping the status quo. Democracy can be inclusionary and exclusionary. It can serve sustainability imperatives, but also undermine them, trump them by endorsements of fossil fueled lives. Then there is the environmental paradox of progressive politics, as researchers on the welfare state, for instance, point out, Bailey being one of them. A paradox shaped by a close link between social emancipation and the destructive colonization of nature. And in another paradox, or let's put it this way, the liberal capitalist growth machine in itself is of a paradoxical nature. That is, it embodies success, social progress, as Pinker points out, and social and ecological destruction. And there is the double role of the state. That is, that the state is both emancipatory and subjecting. It is both a potential powerful tool to redefine the economy, to broaden perspectives on the economy and what the economy does. And it is a powerful to boost the capitalist growth machine, e.g. by property law. See, for instance, the work of Katrin Pister. So paying closer attention, I'm coming to a close, paying closer attention to the benefits of a materially expensive modernity, the benefits of a materially expensive modernity, and the drawbacks of a material reductive modernity without naturalizing benefits and drawbacks may make some strand of ecological transformation may make some strands of the socio-ecological transformation literature more analytical and maybe less blinded by its own normative ideals. While it is certainly true that the present is being pregnant with promising alternative futures, it is also true that the future often boils down to a continuation of the past, and hopefully a more nuanced understanding of the latter may lead to a more nuanced understanding of alternative futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Matthew, it's your turn.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me well? Yeah, great. All right. Well, first of all, I want to just thank Richard for the invitation, and to everyone for attending this, and for those excellent two introductory talks that I learned a great deal from. Viviana, you have sparked my imagination. I'm very excited to research what the stuff that you presented to us. Margaret, I feel like I'm simply going to be a footnote to what you just said. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the puzzle of democratic energy transitions. So it seems to me that I'm going to focus on the move to energy systems that can operate within planetary boundaries. And I think that I think we all can agree that such a transition cannot rapidly occur solely at points of production and distribution without interacting with material and social patterns of everyday life for most people. So for example, it's not sufficient just to say, oh, we'll have giant wind farms or giant solar farms. What we're going to need to do, introducing those new systems will actually have effects on how people lead their lives. And furthermore, we're not going to be able to sustain current systems of provisioning, housing and water and many other less urgent commodities without changing the way in which people interact with those commodities and the space around them. So I think that life within planetary boundaries will likely require fairly significant transformations in how almost all people live. So for a significant population, for the population that is probably listening to this or attending this webinar, and the population that consumes produces most of the carbon in the West, the transformation, I think, will involve at least, and this is not meant to be exhaustive, 3 features. I identify them as limitation, abandonment, and adoption. So limitation paradigmatically involves consuming less, such as traveling less. So here I am, we're on a webinar, we haven't flown somewhere, right? So it would be a lot less travel, for example. Abandonment paradigmatically involves stopping altogether living in a certain way or consuming a certain thing. So for example, you might think of this like moving out of a single family home into a flat in the United States. That would be a big deal because many people live in single family homes or aspire to, or simply giving up eating meat, becoming a vegetarian, or even a vegan. Finally, adoption paradigmatically involves the incorporation of new activities and new material into one's life. So this would be a case of substituting a new practice, say, for example, taking public transport for an old practice, driving one's private car, or when one replaces, say, a heat pump, or uses a heat pump to replace a gas boiler. I think I want to focus on, let's call these private transformations, and I want to focus on them because they occur in people's private lives. And by private lives, I don't want to actually lean too heavily on a private-public distinction. I'm actually more interested in the ways in which the system is within that we encounter, the material stuff that we encounter is the basis for how we, or partially the basis for how we find meaning in our lives. And how we relate to one another and so on. And obviously that's a whole story, but I'm not going to go into it because this is a very brief talk. So I'll just take that for granted and would be glad to talk about it in greater detail later. But I would draw on the work of various philosophers like Joseph Raz and others to talk about the relationship between the material and meaning. But anyway, let me get back here. Okay, right. So private transformations may all be necessary. We might be able to justify these like wholesale transformations in private lives on what philosophers call consequentialist grounds. Basically, the cost of people changing how they live now is minuscule when compared to the current and prospective costs of sustained climate change, right? But wholly consequentialist reasoning, as I think we've seen in today's other presentations, is just, it's a non-starter. One reason why it's a non-starter is that we think we have democratic reasons not to just use, say, well, consequentialist reasoning to justify wholesale transformations. We say, hey, people should have a say, right? And in particular, we think that it's important to some degree that popular deliberation and decision-making undergirds these transformations. In other words, you can't justify radically transforming people's lives just because it'll be good for future generations without consulting those people whose lives are being transformed. On wholly consequentialist grounds, we could do that. We can say, well, the cost today is minuscule, so just push the cost on those people and let them suffer. So I'm going to say that policies that are rejected, after a process of popular deliberation and decision are policies that should be rejected for democratic reasons, right? So if I say I have a democratic reason to reject a policy, it's a reason that I'm to reject the policy on the basis that it's not been accepted through some kind of democratic means. It's been rejected, affirmed, like, you know, I think I just want to I think it's a familiar liberal reason for why, for example, imperial domination ought to be rejected, because imperial domination necessarily, by definition, is anti-democratic, right? So there are many, many reasons to reject imperial domination, and there may be stronger reasons. But I think the fundamental emancipatory reason is democratic, namely, people ought to have a say in how their lives are governed, right? And so an imperial state takes that away. And additionally, I think claims of historic injustice are often claims of domination, and in particular, claims about how domination disrupted or even destroyed meaningful ways of life, with cultural practices lost or abused and new foreign practices put in their place. So this is not the whole story for why we might object to certain forms, you know, not the whole story of historic injustices by any means, but I think it's an important part of the story. Basically, what people complain about, and especially in the case of imperialism, is to say, look, the imperial center imposed their culture on us, and we lost something that was meaningful. We lost a crucial part of how we lead our lives. Now, this is not something, so you might say, oh, well, historic monuments were raised, and buildings that were designed in the metropole were built in their place, for example. Entire villages were rebuilt and in accordance with the rules of the metropole. And let's, contrary to fact, okay, I'm not saying this actually happened, but let's suppose that there was a case in which such transformations occurred and the colonized were better off. They still would have a reason to object, namely a democratic reason. All of this was done without their consultation and their will. Now, maybe that's not a sufficient reason to say, oh, there's, reparations are required. But I think, it's certainly a reason to complain. So let's return now to the question of energy transitions within planetary boundaries. Here's the question that I pose. Are the private transformations required for this transition, are they so significant that they rise to the level that we have democratic reason to consult affected populations? And if so, then we face the prospect of democratic rejection of these transformations, which in turn would make the transitions which are necessary, although I appreciate that, well, we can talk about that. Let's accept for the purposes of my argument that they're necessary. So it in turn suggests that there may not be, we face the prospect of democratic rejection of transformations, which in turn would make the transitions to within planetary boundaries anti-democratic. And it means that there's no wholly just way to achieve an energy transformation. I'll give you examples in a moment. But the upshot is that it suggests that there may not be any democratic reason worth considering when imposing such transitions, since we must pursue these transitions regardless of whether or not they are democratically supported. So consider this as an argument that raises, it's a provocation. It's meant to challenge the notion that the transitions must be democratic, right? And it's meant to suggest that if we seek democratic transitions, we will bump up against, we'll have normative reason, we'll have strong democratic reasons to resist the transitions because people will say no. And if we respect people's voices as crucial for the justification of a transition, then we have therefore a reason not to engage in these transitions. So I'll just give you a quick example from the United States, and I understand that everyone's like, oh God, this sounds horrible. I mean, typical American, but let me give you, Americans can produce an enormous amount of carbon. Easily the most popular cars to drive in the United States right now are gigantic trucks that would be absolutely illegal in the EU and the UK. They're huge. My children, who are average size, and my average size 7-year-old, her head does not go above the grill of the truck. So literally, if she's standing 5 feet in front of these pickup trucks, the driver cannot see her. They have to put a camera on the front of the truck in order to be able to see what you're driving at, because you cannot see it through the windscreen. These trucks are massive. They get horrible gas mileage. People love them. Millions of Americans love them, right? Now, if you say, I want to take away your truck, that's like saying to some Americans, I want to take away your gun. It's a big deal, right? And they'll reject that. More generally, I think that we have to recognize that, now you might say, well, trucks, what do they matter? Well, they're a central element of people's identity. They're an element of the American conception of masculinity. So people's identity as a man, as a male identifying person, is wrapped up in driving these trucks, just the same with driving motorcycles. People's identity as an American, as someone who does hard work. All of these things are wrapped up in driving these trucks. We can say no more trucks, and people will reject it. And then we have to ask ourselves, what do we do with this rejection? Now, I think that we can find examples of this across the board in many, many cultures. And we have to ask ourselves, do the claims of the least well off, those who will be worst affected by climate change, override our democratic reasons to consult the populations affected by private transformations. We don't care that the way you find meaning and value in your life, American man, is such that you reject this energy transformation. The least well off are the ones who are the worst affected, and therefore their claims override yours. Or what we are looking for is a kind of transvaluation of values that necessarily cannot be democratically achieved. Why? Because a transvaluation of values requires the abandonment of current values as they're transformed into new values. And that's always a process that in some ways is anti-democratic. It's a process that occurs over time and it occurs in dribs and drabs, but I don't think it's a process that actually, from where I'm standing now, I say, I'm going to give up everything I value and go to these new values. No, typically what happens is that people are dragged along. Or perhaps we have robust reasons of stability to seek democratic assent of some sort, lest the anti-democratic imposition of private transformations produce especially inefficient, revanchist political responses. And yet there's been an enormous amount of work around housing in the United States. Like, for example, Catherine Einstein's book, Neighborhood Defenders from 2019, that explores how neighborhood consultation in the United States blocks the production of not new housing, and in particular, dense housing. Or, of course, there's the well-known work by Mark Purcell on the local trap that indicates how localized decision-making is neither inherently more just nor ecologically sustainable. And so perhaps then, we should resist the move to democracy as a guiding, as a regulative ideal in our project of seeking energy transitions. I give this brief talk only as a provocation, not as necessarily a thesis that I have sufficiently defended, but rather to raise questions. And I'm so excited to hear what my co-panelists and everyone else has to say in response to them, especially given what my co-panelists said in their presentations, which I think are challenges to the provocation itself. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope I haven't gone over too much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Yeah, we will now turn to questions, but before opening, so you basically also the audience can of course always raise questions, so please just put your questions as always in the chat, or preferably you can also raise your hand as soon as the floor is open and just ask your question directly. I will try to be short. We still have half an hour left, so we'll just maybe ask one question and also try to already open the floor for the panelists, so for Viviana, Margaret, and Matthew, to also engage with each other and maybe comment also on each other presentations. But maybe give you two questions on the way that you might consider or might not consider when also I'm commenting on your colleagues' inputs. So just to recap what we just heard, Viviana kind of offered a social movement, bottom-up perspective to democratization. Then Margaret argued that the history of material expansion and the colonization of nature is in many ways actually closely related to social emancipation and democratization, and therefore implying at least a tension between more emancipation, more democratization, and materially reductive modernity. And then finally, Matthew, in a similar way, confronted us with the prospect of a democratic rejection of transforming energy systems, and thereby raised the question whether democratic reasons for change or non-change should always take the front seat or should be actually considered. And starting the discussion, I will just throw in two questions that I think are also somewhat related. The first, which I think also got quite obvious in some of your talks already, is the obvious question: is there a necessary or non-contingent link between a social-ecological transformation and democratization? Or put it maybe in other words, does a social-ecological transformation hinge in any way on an extended form of democratization, and why should it? And second, a related question to that is, or comes actually from the point that democratization is often associated with from the bottom up. And therefore the question is, top down necessarily undemocratic, so collective and some form of coercive rule setting? And with these questions, I just throw them at you, and I would like you to engage with each other for some minutes before we open the space for the rest. whoever wants to start can just.
I'm happy to start, even though, yeah, no, I'm happy to start. Not sure if I got your first question, Richard. Could you just repeat it? Your first question? I have an answer to the second, but my answer to the second blocked listening to you closely.
The first question was basically, is there a link between more democratization and a social ecological transformation? Because this is always, or very often implied in the literature, that a transformation is necessarily democratic. Yes, this would be the question.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk, Matt, and I mean, you sent around the notes, so I had a little bit more time to think about what you just said. And in response to the first question posed by Richard, I think Matt provides enough evidence to show that there is no direct link between democracy and sustainability. For EU funding agencies, there is often the talk about the twin transition, so that sustainability goes really well with digitalization. I think we also have a twin transition talk in some strands of the socio-ecological transformation literature, that sustainability always goes together with democratization. And maybe this twin transition assumption, yeah, and I think it's really important to question that. And the reasons for questioning that is not because it's fun to take a stab at democracy. It's just because what Matt is pointing out. I mean, if democracy is understood as or is interpreted along the principle of those who are affected are supposed to have a say, then of course there can be anti-democratic outcomes, and we see them on a constant basis. Right-wing populism is not per se anti-democratic; it's anti-liberal democratic, but not anti-democratic. And the work mentioned by Matt, Catherine Einstein's work, like this neighborhood associations that actually block public housing, that's a well-known phenomenon in North America. So that's also, as I mentioned in my talk, democracies can be inclusionary, they can be exclusionary, they can go well together with sustainability goals, but actually also block them. And then I think I'm coming to your second question, the top-down, bottom-up. As you know, I'm kind of critical of bottom-up only, or celebrations of bottom-up, not because I'm pro-authoritarian and also not. So, I mean, top-down is not forcibly anti-democratic. And what actually keeps the principle of affected in check is constitutions. This is what we see in the United States. This is what we see in other countries. I mean, you can push for anti-racist law, not because people agree to that, but based on, for instance, like just mentioned that, anti-racism, you can do that based on universal principles that are laid down in constitutions. That applies to women's rights, that applies to racial policies, and that may also apply to sustainability law. So if climate protection is part of a constitution, not that I build all my hopes on that, but I think that would be a check for democracy interpreted as those who are affected are need to have a say. Like, we also need universal principles somewhere put down in constitutions. And that would be realizing sustainability top-down by appealing to those principles and making decisions against nationalistic impulses, personal impulses whatsoever. That would be my responses.
Okay, I can go on. Thanks. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the presentation, which were both very interesting. Yes, I would tend to agree with Margaret, actually. So on the two answers. So top-down is not necessarily undemocratic. So what do we mean by top-down? Is top-down, of course, it doesn't mean, if it means a dictatorship, of course, that's definitely not democratic, but top-down normally means that you need to have a consent also of the masses, let's say, but you are not directly, something is not emerging from the bottom up, but you need to have some democratic processes in which or some legitimacy, let's say, no. So which means that a top-down policy is not necessarily undemocratically, especially so if when it considers, for example, what Matthew was talking about previously, so the least well-off, for the minorities, no? So we know that democracy is the, let's say, the regime that actually takes into consideration also the rights of minorities, no? That's exactly one of the fundamental features of democracy. And yes, I agree also that not necessarily sustainability goes together with democracy. Of course, it would be ideal if it were the case, but it's not always the case. I'm thinking about the first example is the Gilets jaunes a few years ago. So there was a, let's say, we can think about it as a sustainability policies that, however, was not considering the less well-off, no? And in that sense, it created also a mobilization of from people that were not necessarily against the ecological transition. Actually, they were against the fact that this was basically they were the ones that covering the highest cost of the ecological transition, no? So we know that sustainability policy cannot satisfy all the sectors of population. Democracy is not satisfying everyone, so some people will have to lose more than others, and those people that are supposed to lose according to a democratic process should be the ones that now are the ones that are, let's say, how to say, externalizing more than other their environmental and social cost onto others, no? So the idea of the imperial mode of living, for example, no? So there are certain strata of population that is actually has more imperial ways of life than other strata of population, even in northern countries, no? So yes, I think more or less these are my answers.
I have nothing to add. I'm happy to keep going.
If the audience wants to raise questions, then please just raise your hands. And yes, we have around 20 minutes left for Q&A. If there are no questions so far, oh no, there is, of course. Michael, please.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for the great inputs. It's a very fascinating question we are discussing here. I take from Matthew the very interesting argument, and I think I agree that the transformation of current values into new values can never be democratic. But I think in a way, it's never democratic because it's always a result. At least it's always a result of something. And I think the process of that transformation, that can be democratic. And when I was thinking about the trucks, I think we all know that in some positive future, those trucks need to be taken away from people or exchanged for something else. And we need to convince those people to go with that process. And I'm more thinking in those days about how do you convince people about that? And I think the only way to do that is to give them something instead, and to offer them something that is even better than what they have now. So the question I want to ask is, what do we offer people so they actually subscribe to that idea of a good life with boundaries? Is it more free time? Is it more material security? Is it more a sense of equality? Is it more time for care activities? So what is it that you would offer people that they actually say, okay, I give away my truck? So that's my basic question.
Thank you. We have a second question, so we collect maybe 2 or 3, and then Andreas.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for this these interesting presentations. And in continuation of what Michael just said, I think that the democratic challenge consists in 2 parts. And the one is, which Michael just raised, we have to think of how to get broader support for these ecological concerns, and that implies linking it to social or short-term issues. Yes, that's one thing, but I think there is a second issue that has somehow been lost, that social progress is always contested, which implies that there are conflicts and there will be no agreement. And I think the second challenge, and the way Matthew described these persons, that there are people with smaller cars in Austria, but with probably a similar mentality. And I find it very improbable that I or someone else will be able to convince them. We will simply have to impose what is good, or what we consider to be good, and to be able to impose it, we have to be a sufficient number of persons to think the same way. I mean, I think there's an over-emphasis on pedagogy. I think it's hardly anybody, I hope so, wants to pedagogically convince fascists that they should not stick to this, at least to stick to these opinions. I think there is a role for pedagogy, to be short, and a role for coercion and limiting the possibility of other persons to do what is socially destructive.
Thank you. There's 2 more questions that we will still take, and then go back to the panelists. The first one was Tadeusz Darski, if that is correct.
Yes, kind of. Hi. I was going to ask Viviana about this public commons partnership, because this is a phrase I have heard before, and I know that, or I read that Ghent made this like commons transition plan of how can the city Ghent be more aligned with the commons principles, etc. And yet I haven't heard that much more about it. So I'm wondering whether there's more examples from throughout the world of places that are going more in this commons public partnerships rather than the private public partnership. And then I was wondering, how does it align with some kind of ideas about non-for-profit businesses from the degrowth perspective? And I'm asking because I see this is something that I see a value in, of actually people bottom up, making these provisioning systems rather than a huge welfare state, but then actually taking the commodification and the logic, profit logic out of this. So yeah, if you have more ideas on this or practical examples, that would be super nice. Thanks.
Thank you. And the last hand that is raised, please. Gautier. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I suppose I just wanted to follow up a little bit, or to clarify one of the points, which sort of follows from Andreas' comment and also the comment from someone before that, which is like, I mean, of course, we won't be able to convince everyone, and there will be, you know, there'll be people who might always be opposed to those ideas of either social progress or transition for more ecological society. But isn't there one of the points, though, that like not only it is least well-off who are suffering the most from, and will be suffering the most from like ecological issues, but but they're also the biggest number of people. I mean, isn't there the point that we don't necessarily want everyone to agree to that transition, but a large majority of people? And isn't that where the idea of democratization comes in, which is actually to transition from a situation where a minority and actually the well-off are controlling most of the economy to a situation where we hand over more control of the economy to a larger amount of people, so they can make decisions that fit them. And sure, we don't know exactly if they will make the kind of right decision according to the transition we have in mind, but at least it's likely that when we can combine social and ecological issues, people who are actually suffering the most, who are also a majority, will find interest into the kind of ideas we are proposing. So isn't that where really democratization comes in? It's kind of transitioning from the minority of people who currently control the economy to a larger majority who have actually interest in the transition we are proposing, because we are linking ecological and social issues together.
Thank you very much. Yeah, whoever wants to answer first, just go ahead.
I can try. Okay, so the first, well, the question addressed only to me, no, from Haderer, no, don't know whether I'm pronouncing correctly, about a public common partnership. I think, I mean, to my knowledge, there are quite few examples around, let's say. I know that in Naples, there have been quite interesting cases of public common partnerships, so to say. So, for example, the Asilo Filangieri in Naples. But I'm not actually aware of other experiences. I think in the book, actually, by Dardot, Christian Laval, and Dardot on the commons, they actually talk also about other cases in France, in Paris, if I remember correctly, and Naples. They also mentioned Naples. So they also espouse this. They have much similarities with this perspective of public from the common. Actually, I found it very interesting to read their perspective on public ownership. And also I mentioned Andrew Combers as well. But in terms of initiatives, I think there are very few around, at least to my knowledge. Then the question on about that Andreas and Michael were posing, no? I think that most of the challenge comes from the fact that I mean, the way also, I mean, the way education, the role of education, I mean, it can seem to be like maybe a not important issue, but I think the role that education plays, not just in the school system, let's say, but for also building this, no, Andreas was saying that we don't have to convince them, no? I agree, but I think that also, let's say, there are certain structural reasons why we do have also people espousing a right-wing government, no? So the fact that also the way the media as well is structured, that is not really, let's say, contributing to this idea of civil society that some like from Habermas and so on, for example, envisioned, no? So there is a power also acting already in the public sphere. So let's say trying to act starting from the education system, but also the media trying to so that there is more let's just think, for example, what is happening now in Russia, no? Where there is some clear propaganda, but this is happening. There is propaganda also in a certain way, also of course in Western countries. If I think about my own country, for example, there are huge problems in terms of ownership of the media. Who owns the media? So there are really very, very few actors that owns all the TVs and newspapers, and this is actually going also to limit any democratic potential, any possibility to discuss about, for example, truly about the ecological transition. And then we have our Minister for Ecological Transition that actually is giving subsidies, for example, to substitute the car with a new one, or to buy a new TV, or but it's called the Minister of Ecological Transition, no? Or now it's actually a new. Well, we have the problem, of course, with the gas, and so lots of lots of coal. Basically, I don't have the word. Mine are going to open again actually in Italy, and this is all done thanks to the Minister of Ecological Transition. So, I mean, there is a problem in terms of that I see also in terms of the public debate. No, so what we are discussing, what is discussed, for example, in the news every day, until we don't fix this, it's difficult to have also a supportive majority, a majority supportive for a real social-ecological transformation.
I think we would need to go to the next speaker, maybe.
Sorry, I'm done.
Perfect, thanks.
Margaret, would you mind if I weighed in here for a moment?
You go ahead, because the question was addressed to you. That's fine.
Okay. Is it Michael? Or I think that the question of what do we offer people so that they question. I think speaking to people's actions is really important in feel there's an urgent problem. And so I think you're entirely correct. In order to move people away, so for example, I used to live in Northern England, and one of my colleagues I co-wrote my book with, studies energy transitions at this kind of granular level. And one of the difficulties he claimed they have is convincing people to switch out their gas boilers to heat pumps. And part of the reason why is that there's just a cultural meaning. Like there's just all sorts of, there's your home. Do you have to come in and rip this thing out of my wall? Like there's all sorts of ways of life. There's people are, in his words, can be, even people who are, say, progressive can be conservative in how they want their daily life to go. And so these disruptions and mode of thought, and I do think that the points that Viviana raised, in particular, her indication of these experiments in living that pop up in other places, and the different ways in which we can encourage them to pop up, do provide people with alternatives we can gesture to and say, see, that's nice, and the ways that you can recognize, you already can recognize is nice. Would you like to have some of that? So for example, if you, in the United States, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be overly US centric, it's just where I have to have the most amount of information about, if you pedestrianize streets, people say, oh, look, pedestrianized streets are actually kind of nice. Okay, let's give up some space for cars. Let's take space away from cars. But you actually do have to create the material transformation so that you can gesture to people and see that life is better in those cases. So again, I think it's a puzzle, and I think it's multi-layered. Just my last comment on both Gautier and Andreas. I love both your questions as well. I think they're really difficult, and I just would like to recast them in one way and hand it off to Margaret and see what she has to say about this. Maybe this is a wrong way to recast it, but I sometimes think of this as a question of veto points. Like, where are the places in society where people can say no and it matters, right? Like, at what grain, or what tranche of people? So the way Gautier put it to a certain degree, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, by the way, the way he put it was that, well, there's a small number of people who have benefited a great deal, and then there's lots of other people who are the least well off, who are the greatest number of people. So the implication there is that wealthy people who are consuming a lot actually shouldn't get a veto over transformations, over how their lives will change in energy transitions. A lot of people say that, hey, look, you live in a society that benefited from 150 years of CO2 emissions. Your opinion, you don't get to say no anymore because you've gotten so much benefit. And I know that's a caricature. So anyway, I'd like to, is that a bad way to think about it? I don't know. It's the way that I sometimes am drawn into thinking about it and where the veto points ought to be. Margaret, I don't mean to force you to answer that question. It's just one I pose, and I feel like you probably would have something good to say in response to it, but please don't feel obligated to answer it. Thank you very much.
I actually don't have an answer. So, but I took Gautier's point. So you suggested the way I would put it, a democratization of the elite. Yeah, but democratization per se, and here I'm again with Matt, does not yet point us to any good, does not automatically point us towards a better direction. So yeah, so democratization does not do the trick. Democratization by itself does not do the trick, same as efficiency doesn't do the trick. It really depends on also, yeah, as a remapping goals, normative goals, or defining where the transition ought to go. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a better answer. And very briefly on the sweetening the deal, I think actually Richard has a pretty good answer to that, how that can be done, because he studied a concrete example in Vienna, and it would be interesting to very briefly hear about that, how deals can be sweetened and people can be won over to actually maybe question car mobility.
You want me to jump in? Yes, I can do that. So we're basically just studying where the question we raised was, how would climate politics, effective and feasible climate politics, look in a peripheral neighborhood in Vienna, where you have a lot of conservative and right-wing voters, basically. And if you go there and yeah, to give some context on this neighborhood, it's very car-centric. And if you go there basically and say, okay, look, people, we should not use the car anymore so much because of climate change, because we're facing a climate collapse, there is no majorities for that. So what we ask the people is actually what makes a good life for you in the neighborhood. And the thing that made a good life for them was that since the last 30 years, they lost a lot of non-essential local provisioning, bars, restaurants, small-scale shops, and so on. And this is what they really said, this is what we want to have back. So we conducted a citizen forum there, framing this forum not as a climate assembly, but as an assembly to strengthen non-essential local provisioning. And through this kind of framing, we're really able to at least problematize car dependency again. Because by using this idea of, this is basically the idea that you undermine your own collective desire by the mode of traffic, this did not dissolve conflicts at all, but it opened conflicts again. It was able to problematize and politicize an issue that was a non-issue before. This was the carrot, so to say. With, of course, the stick that cars need to be reduced at some point. Yeah, I think also we need to end, actually. We only have 3 minutes left. So thank you, everyone, for this really interesting discussion. It was very, very exciting 1.5 hours. Before we end, I end with a short advertisement. On the 8th of November, there is the last part of our webinar series. Participants will be Christine Planck, Corinna Dengler, and Julie Fraud, moderated by Andreas Novi. So please join in again, same time, same place. And yes, enjoy your evening, and thanks for joining in.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there is a question in the chat.
Thank you very much.
The previous seminar was also recorded and will be uploaded just as this webinar. So if anyone could not join, it will be online as well.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you. Richard,
Yeah,
for organizing.
thanks for organizing, and it was very interesting, an interesting exchange. Thanks for attendance. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.